So you're at a place where you've decided you want to change your school. You've read or heard enough about the Cohesive Schools framework and school improvement planning that you want learning in your classrooms and in your school to be more cohesive. You want the classrooms to produce academic momentum. That's where students gain ground year after year the longer they're at your school. This is the ultimate goal of the Cohesive Schools framework. We can help. Sometimes the transition to look at data or evidence for cohesive learning can be daunting. It's new. We can provide a summary and identify patterns for you. Let's talk about some examples of what we can do. We can help you recognize the patterns of achievement and growth that provide a foundation or a context for school improvement. Questions like, why do we need to change? What does this new learning look like? What does cohesive learning look like in the classroom? What does it look like in real life and in the data when all the components of content and instruction come together to produce accelerated learning for most students? We can dig into the question of who is learning and at what rates. That often brings surprising results to school leaders. What do we do that's different? Well, we can analyze up to 3 years of your data, and we can look for these patterns and clues and set the stage for your school improvement planning. We utilize growth data for top performing and bottom performing students to help you understand which students are benefiting from the learning most within your current curriculum and instruction. Let's look at a model for how we can approach data differently. Think about these arrows or lines as representing the growth of different students over time. The blue line is the growth rate for students who were initially most proficient, the top quartile. The maroon line represents the growth rate for students who were initially the lowest performing students. We call that quartile A. We get these rates by looking at students in cohorts and quartiles. When these lines are parallel, both groups are growing at the same rate. The gaps aren't growing, but they're not shrinking either. The slope of the line tells you the growth rate for each. You can see in this example, the rates start parallel but diverge. The lower performing group is losing ground and gaps are growing, as indicated by the distance between the two lines increasing. What are some regular patterns that we see in school data? Let's talk about 4 examples. Most commonly, the top performing students, that purple line or blue line, they're increasing in learning over time, and bottom performing students aren't. That means that the purple line or the blue line is growing at a rate that is faster than the maroon line, and gaps are increasing. Another common pattern, the second one, is really a post-pandemic pattern. That's where we see that the top line growth is flat, or it's not as high as we'd want it to be. And this would indicate that content may have been reduced, it's being over-scaffolded, or taught at a surface level. In effect, higher performing students aren't learning at high rates, and they're perhaps unchallenged. A third example is that sometimes lower performing students are accessing core instruction, and so that maroon line is steeper. They're learning at higher rates, while their higher performing peers might be flat. In this case, the gaps are closing, but the overall performance can't raise above a certain point because top performing students aren't gaining ground. And the fourth example is that in other cases, top performers are growing slowly and bottom performers are growing slowly. So the gaps aren't really growing or shrinking, but both groups are lagging. Again, we see this pattern sometimes post-pandemic. Each of these scenarios informs us and school leaders about how to plan for improvement. They also tell us what questions to ask, what is the input from teachers that's most valuable for the process. And each scenario helps us determine what data we should look at to monitor the progress of our school improvement plans. Let's look at 2 of these scenarios more closely and talk about how they inform us differently. The first scenario is that flat growth for top performers, but good growth for low performers. So low performing students are obviously accessing core instruction. Their line is steeper. If they weren't, they'd have flat growth. But top performing students can't experience growth unless the content is increased. And so the gaps are closing, but not in the way that you would want. Whatever teachers are doing, their lowest learners are getting it, but top performing students are not being challenged, so they have flatline growth. In a cohesive learning language, we would focus on curriculum and instruction improvements in category 2 or factor 2, strengthening content and increasing learning. We shouldn't see a big increase in gaps when we increase content because both lines can tilt up. Both lines can increase because lower performing students are already accessing core instruction. That's an important distinction. Let's look at a second related example. This one is flat growth for top performers, just like in the previous example, but low growth for low performing students. In this case, low performing students are not accessing core instruction at acceptable rates. If they were, they would show growth. It would be a steeper line. And top performing students also aren't experiencing growth unless we raise the content, just like in the last scenario. But in this case, the lower performing students show little or no growth, which means they're not accessing learning or core instruction at high rates. If, like in the last example, we decided to raise the content, we would see the blue line increase over time. Higher performing students would learn more content, but gaps would increase. And so in this scenario, when we raise the content, remember, factor 2, we must also increase students' access to relevant and usable background knowledge. We would describe that in factor 1. And so one action alone, just raising the content level, would result in very inequitable learning opportunities, and we would see gaps skyrocket. In these two scenarios, the cohesive framework tells us our plans, our next steps, and it tells us that they're different. As we talk to teachers, the questions we ask in each scenario would be different. In scenario 1, we would say your lowest performing students are growing strongly. Where are some places we can increase the content or rigor for all of your students? In scenario 2, we would say we need to ramp up content so that top performing students and all students can learn more. But what are some ways that we can scaffold or provide support for your lowest performing students so they can access this increased content as well? So what can we do to help you? Click on the link to find out more. We can analyze your school's achievement and growth data. We can look at achievement and growth patterns over years to provide you with context and a foundation for your planning. We can dig deep to help you find your starting place and your next steps in planning and how to talk to teachers. When you click the link, we'll contact you. We'll evaluate the data you have available to see how we can best help you in your school improvement efforts. Each school and each data set is different. So click on the link and find out how we can help you.